powers have been prohibited to them. The Constitution was written under what's called the principle of positive grant. And what positive grant means is that if it wasn't enumerated or if it wasn't listed in the Constitution, then the federal Congress of the United States simply didn't have the power to do anything. And that was how it was supposed to be. And when you read this document, one of the funniest sentences in it to someone today is the part where they say that Congress must meet at least once per year. And so what that kind of means is back in the day, they were actually worried about, Congress never meeting. And obviously, these days, it's a bit of more of a full-time job, although, believe it or not, they do have quite a bit of vacation time as well. And what each congressman does when they enter into office, and actually each member of the state legislature as well, they all swear an oath to serve and protect the Constitution of the United States. So, like a state legislature in Pennsylvania would swear an oath to the Constitution, the federal Constitution, also the state, whereas the federal representatives only swear an oath to the United States Constitution. So, again, we'll kind of go through almost by topic, because it's a little bit scattered if you actually go through the Constitution. The first topic is actually, and I'll briefly list the topics. We'll go through war and the right to bear arms, which in a lot of ways is the most important, I would say, power that actually is given to Congress. The second is economic powers. And again, this is where what powers they do not have is quite also important. And I'll be going into detail on several of the defenses when you ask, like for instance, Speaker Pelosi, and explain in a little bit of detail about the General Welfare Clause, the Necessary and Proper Clause, etc. I'll be talking about criminal and tort law, immigration, and what's in the Constitution that has to deal with immigration, taxation, the money power, and then we'll get into, provided we have time, like the amendments. What I'd like to do is, if there's questions or if people have comments or clarifications, or even just to challenge me on something I've said, please do so kind of at any time. It's meant to be a bit of a discussion. So on war, in Article 1, Section 8, it gives Congress the power to declare war, and it reads, to declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures on land and water. So, does anyone have an idea why Congress would give, or why the writers of the Constitution would give the federal Congress the authority to declare war rather than, say, the executive branch?
That's a lot of power.
You got people from all over the country with different opinions arguing out the causes of the war, reasons why they need to go and rectify whatever their situations, rather than having one omnipotent man, as we talked about.
Exactly.
Just going around, I don't like Porsche or whatever,
Yeah, exactly. The colonists, when they had founded the country, were very concerned about King George, and actually specifically a monarchy. But they realized that when they wrote the Constitution, they wanted to separate the checks and balances as much as possible, so that no one man could take the nation off to war. And so they gave Congress the ability to declare war. They have not always done so. For instance, the last time we actually declared war was, I believe, December 8th for Pearl Harbor. So that was actually the last war that we had. And what's a little bit off topic is what I follow is what's known as the Christian just theory of war. And just very briefly, the war must be legal, so it needs to be declared by a legislative body. But it also needs to be a just war in that it can't be preemptive. It needs to be a last resort, so everything else has to be exhausted. And what actually this phrase has in it, grant letters of marque and reprisal. Letters of reprisal were kind of a stepwise way that the founders built in, so you didn't have to declare war. If someone destroyed something that belonged to the United States, you could say, okay, we're going to issue a letter of reprisal, we're going to do whatever this is, and then we're going to kind of end it. Unless, things kind of, but it would move in a stepwise direction, and it was made to try and avoid war, because war is very destructive. Actually, the American Revolution is probably one of the very few wars in all of history where you can make an argument that afterwards there was actually an expansion of liberty. Most wars that are held throughout time, liberty contracts, freedom contracts, wealth is destroyed. It's the patterns of what war really is. And the other thing actually on letters of marque was that Congress had the ability to go out and basically mark enemies. And they last used this during the 1800s with the Barbary pirates. And they had these small groups that were attacking the United States. So instead of, going after, say, the country that they were from, they just said, okay, all these folks, they're marked enemies, and we're going to go after them. We're going to, destroy their ships or disable their ships or take them to trial or what have you, because they were plundering American shipping.
It didn't have to be a nation state.
It didn't have to be a nation state, correct.
And to step that up a little bit further, folks, all the countries at that time, Spain, England, France, the United States of America, would declare marque to any private, to keep themselves from having to build up their military strength and tax the people in this regard. And letter of marque also authorizes you to keep the spoils of what you've conquered and taken. Now that's back in the 17th and 18th century.
Right, and in some cases you can even apply it to today, like an alternative solution, like our country has been really at war. Again, if you go back actually in history to the Iraq War, there was actually there was actually a joint resolution sponsored in the House of Representatives in committee to declare war, to make a formal declaration. It was actually voted down. So there was actually a procedural step that was made at one point to try and follow the Constitution, because that's what it's there for, to be followed. And obviously it didn't make any difference. What Congress does now is they kind of delegate to the president. So when they go out and they campaign, we delegate to the president, So, in this case, Barack Obama, it was George Bush before. These folks are, this guy's running the war, and they're responsible for it. But the reality is, Congress is responsible, and they have pretty much illegally delegated their authority to the president. And really, the only
So they
thing.
don't have to face the voters at home.
Exactly. The only thing that they still have is they have to have votes for appropriation of money to continue funding it. But those are
Nobody
always.
pays attention to that.
It's true. So any other questions on war? We're actually going to move on to right to bear arms, and also about standing Navy and Air Force and Marines. The Second Amendment of the Constitution reads that a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The way that you have to actually go back into and examine what they actually meant, but when they said militia, they really just meant everyone, or everyone that was armed and willing to defend the country. And so what they actually said is, again, it was a prohibition on Congress, on the federal Congress, that they cannot make any law considering, they can't restrict gun rights or the right to bear arms or what have you. And what I tell people, and I believe this is also the constitutional view of things, is that the right to bear arms isn't just about